In this video, I will show you how to install Alpine Linux on a Raspberry Pi in the so-called diskless mode. I will use a Raspberry Pi 4, but the procedure is the same for the Raspberry Pi 3 and 3B. Before I start with installation and talk about the diskless mode and how it works, let me first go through the Raspberry Pi's different connectors. On this short edge, you can see the Gigabyte Ethernet port. Next to it are two USB 3 and two USB 2 ports. On this longer edge, you'll find an audio output jack, a camera connector, two micro HDMI ports where you can connect each one monitor to, and a USB-C port that is used to power the Raspberry Pi. On the next shorter edge again, there are some status LEDs down here and a display connector. Finally, on the longer edge down here, you find the general purpose I/O port with its 40 pins, which you can, for example, use to control external devices. When you turn the Raspberry Pi around, you'll find the SD card reader, which the Pi uses to boot an operating system. Installing Alpine Linux on an SD card so that the Raspberry Pi can boot from it is simple. First, you need an SD card reader for your Mac or PC, like this one. Insert an SD card into the reader and connect it to your computer and wait until it recognizes the card. The next step will be to partition the SD card with one large FAT32 partition. Under Windows, you can use the tool DiskPart for that. Press the Windows key R to open the Run Command dialog. Enter DiskPart, run. Windows will ask for elevated administrator rights. You say yes, and the DiskPart tool comes up. First, we're going to have a look at all the disks in the system by typing list disk. As you can see, the computer I'm using has 3 disks, and by looking at the size, disk 2 is our SD card. The next command I'm going to call is now select disk 2. Now I want to have a look whether there's anything on that card. I can say list partition. There is no partition on this disk to show because it's an empty SD card. Next we're going to call create partition primary, which creates a primary partition over the whole SD card. The next step now is to format this SD card. Now the machine is formatting the SD card and we'll be able to access it now. We can again say list volumes. List volume, and there it is as volume D. The next step is to download Alpine Linux and copy it on the SD card. Go to alpinelinux.org and then on downloads. And when you scroll down, you find here the Raspberry Pi section. And the one we don't want to download is the ARM 64-bit version. So click on that button and it'll download onto your hard drive. Once the download is finished, you can use a tool like 7-zip to open up the file which has the ending tar gzip. Open the tar inside the gzip. Go in the root directory and then take all the files and simply copy them by drag and drop onto the SD card. And once we're done, we insert that SD card back in the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi then will start and read the bootcode bin file, which will then load the Linux kernel and boot up Alpine Linux. Take the SD card out of the reader, put it into the Raspberry Pi. Connect the monitor, a keyboard, and finally the power. And here we can see the Raspberry Pi booting up. It shows the rainbow screen where it's reading the bootcode bin. And here we go. Alpine Linux booting on a Raspberry Pi. I can log in with root. And here we are. And that's it for today.